Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of B.L.O.K Sports. I am your host, Michael Jefferson, and I am glad to be here on another day saying welcome again, welcome to another edition, to another show, another great day to be in the house and be able to say, hey, we're going to have a great day talking about past football games and this past weekend. But just in case you need to get in contact with me and you want to make sure that we're in a position to be able to cover your games and all of the things that we have for you, please get in contact with me via my website at www.yourstreet.tv. That's www.yourstreet.tv. And if you want to try to reach me other ways, you can also call me or try to reach me via my email address at michaelj@jcconnect. That's michaelj@jcconnect.net. And my rule of thumb is this. If you are unable to get in contact with me within 24 hours, or I don't respond to you within 24 hours, please make sure that you contact me one more time. Because more than likely that means I am working with another customer, working on another project, are currently occupied doing something else. But make sure, guys, either via my website, so hopefully you're watching via my website at www.yourstreet.tv, or contact me, as I said, via my email address at michaelj@jcconnect.net. And folks, this was another weekend of great football. Don't know how many of you had the opportunity and the pleasure to be able to support your favorite football team, but I was able to go out of town this weekend, cover Jackson State playing Tuskegee, and I'll get to that score in a few minutes, especially when I get to the SIAC. But this was a weekend that I said there was one team that should have been on upset alert before the game even started. And was I correct? Yes. But we'll get to the score in just a few minutes. But more than anything else, guys, I have to say this, and I will say it on each and every show that I do. Make sure, guys, that you support your HBCU. Join your National Alumni Association. If you attended Lane College, if you attended Bowie State, if you attended Clark Atlanta, if you attended Prairie View, if you attended Southern University, if you attended Johnson C. Smith, if you attended Kentucky State, Albany State, Jackson State, it doesn't matter the university or college you attended. Please make sure you join your National Alumni Association. The reason being is because we always complain about why isn't our band bigger? Why isn't the football team better? Why aren't the academics at our universities any better? Why don't we have more of this, more of that, more of this, more of that? Join your National Alumni Association. And after you join your National Alumni Association, find a local chapter that you can be a part of, and then support the local chapter and give. And speaking of that, I need to pay some dues over at my local chapter. And because guess what? I'm president of the local chapter in Indianapolis, Indiana, and I owe some money. So guess what I need to do? I need to make sure I pay and I continue to give. And that's one of the things that I did this past weekend. I gave back to Jackson State. I hosted a pregame show, had a chance to interview a couple of people there, and we had a great time. So if you want to see what we did, just make sure you go online. Look for the pregame show at Jackson State versus Tuskegee, and you should be able to find the whole show. But with all of that being said, let's get down to the nitty-gritty for why we are here. we're going to take a look at all four conferences and how well they actually did during this past weekend's football games, as well as the upcoming games for this week and their standings. So let's start off as we normally do with the CIAA. And here we are. So with the CIAA, Shaw, as you can see, and for the most part, all of the home teams won, with the exception of one. And Ferrum College defeated Shaw. As you can see, they were hosting Shaw. And Ferrum defeated Shaw by a score of 14-6. Next, Johnson C. Smith continues to roll, defeating Elizabeth City by a score of 21-17. They went into their home and defeated Elizabeth City. Delaware State, even though I do understand Bowie State is a Division II school, but Delaware State is continuing on their winning ways. And we'll get a little bit deeper into that when we get to the MEAC scores. But Delaware State defeated Bowie State by a score of 36-14. Edward Waters, another school continuing on their roll, even though they're in the SIAC, they're continuing on their roll, defeating the projected number one team in the CIAA by a score of 41-38. Great game. Awesome game. Came down to the end where Edward Waters was able to pull it out over Virginia Union. Winston-Salem, 51. Lincoln of Pennsylvania, 14. Wingate defeated Bluefield State by a score of 72-7. Little bit out of the water here for Bluefield State. And North Carolina Central had a little bit of mercy on Fayetteville State, defeating Fayetteville State by a score of 49-19. Now let's take a look at the standings. Here we are with Johnson C. Smith. As you can see, no one has played a conference game as of yet, but they're getting ready to occur. So when next week rolls around, we'll be into conference games. But Johnson C. Smith, as you can see, the only undefeated team in the conference with a record of 3-0. Next, you have Winston-Salem, 2-1. And then you have several teams with a record of 1-1. Bowie State, Livingstone, Virginia State, and Virginia Union round out all of the teams with a 1-1 record. Next, you have Bluefield State, record of 1-2. But then you have Lincoln of Pennsylvania, Shaw, Elizabeth City, and Fayetteville State yet to taste victory. And as you can see, games that's upcoming this weekend, you have Shaw traveling to Lincoln of Pennsylvania. Elizabeth City will host Fayetteville State. And as I said, now you're coming into conference games. As I said, Winston-Salem will host Virginia State. Livingstone will host Bowie State. And I believe the game of the week, and up to this point, the game of the season, between Johnson C. Smith and Virginia Union. And this game will be played in Virginia Union's backyard, where they will host Johnson C. Smith. And I believe this is one of three major games that will actually decide who will play for the conference championship. One, Johnson C. Smith, of course, in this game against Virginia Union. The next game, Johnson C. Smith, when they play Virginia State. And also when the two Virginias, Virginia State and Virginia Union, when those two hook up. So those three games will be the one, as far as I'm concerned, will be the three determining games that will determine who will play for the conference championship. Now, there may be some other surprises because, as we see, Bowie State is slowly but surely trying to rekindle that once pride that they had, that once that team that was always on top of the division. But we'll see. As of course, Virginia State and Virginia Union, they played heavy hitters this past weekend. So we'll see whether or not, of course, each team is 1-1. Johnson C. Smith is sitting on top. And if anybody can bring Johnson C. Smith down, it has to be Virginia Union. And that game is going to be this upcoming weekend. Now, with what Coach Flowers is doing right now with with Johnson C. Smith, that's going to be a very interesting task, because with Coach Flowers and what he's doing with Johnson C. Smith, that's going to be interesting. But with Coach Parker in his 7th year with Virginia Union, we will see whether or not he comes up with some plans to actually stop Coach Flowers and Johnson C. Smith. I really want to be at that game. Don't know if I'll be able to make it. Some other things have come up, but I'm still going to take a look and see if I can make that game. But either way, I will do a pregame show prior to the showing of that game. So keep your eyes and ears open for that. But I can tell you right now, that's going to be the game. That's going to be the first of 3 games, I believe, that will determine who will play for the championship. As I said, Bowie State may have something to say in the end, but I believe Johnson C. Smith or one of the other 2 Virginia schools, Virginia Union or Virginia State, will be in the championship game. One of those 3 teams will be in the championship game. And right now, with the way Johnson C. Smith, barring injuries, with the way Johnson C. Smith is playing right now, I believe Johnson C. Smith will probably lock up one of those positions. But we shall see, and it will be determined by this game, this weekend. And that game, as I mentioned, will be in Richmond, Virginia, in Virginia Union's stadium. Now let's take a look at the games that were played on, let me go to the right one. Let's go to the games that were played, there we go, in the SIAC. And here we go. Games that were played in the SIAC. And on Thursday night, September 11th, you had Clark Atlanta, as you can see, hosting Fort Valley State. Now, this game here, guys, let me tell you, Fort Valley State put on one hell of a show all the way up into the 4th quarter. Fort Valley State, and we'll take a look at the standings, but let me tell you, their record does not indicate how good this team is. They gave Clark Atlanta everything they could handle. And even though, folks, you will see that the score was 26-21, Fort Valley State, as I said, they gave Clark Atlanta everything. They were leading in the 4th quarter, Fort Valley State, and Clark Atlanta had to claw back and win, and they had to hold on to win this game. This game was on Thursday night, as you can see. But Fort Valley State, let me tell you, folks, they lost this game, but they lost to a better team. But let me tell you one other thing. They are not going to lose too many more games. And if teams are not prepared and ready to play Fort Valley State, that passing game is really good. They have a great passing game, good, strong quarterback, and also they have a guy that I'm very familiar with. And his name happens to be Willie Totten. Why does that name sound familiar to some of you old heads out there? He was the quarterback that threw to a guy by the name of, I don't know if you might remember him, but his name was, or should I say is, Jerry Rice. So Willie Totten and Jerry Rice, they played for Mississippi Valley State under a coach by the name of the Gunslinger. And trust me, Willie Totten slung that sucker all over the football field. And he had a host of individuals who were able to catch that ball. And let me tell you, he has a quarterback that can sling that ball right now. And for whatever team that they're playing against, if they're not ready, Fort Valley State may run you out of the stadium. Now, granted, Clark Atlanta only scored 26 points. But Clark Atlanta also has a very good defense, which was able to hold Fort Valley State to only 21 points. But there were times, I'm going to let you know, Fort Valley State looks very strong. And if I'm not mistaken, this is Coach Totten's first year at Fort Valley State. And with that being the case, guys, they're going to be tough. They are going to be a tough out the rest of this season. So let's continue on with the rest of the scores. But that's something that I had to point out about how well Fort Valley State played, even though all the credit needs to go to Clark Atlanta because they're looking pretty good in the conference. But this was only their first conference game. But let's take a look, as I said, at the rest of the scores. Now, here we are. Benedict trying to make a comeback after their coach left for South Carolina State. Benedict defeated Central State. Central State is having a rough go of it, folks. But they went into the home of Central State and defeated them by a score of 10-0. Howard University went up to New York, went up to the Meadowlands, if I'm not mistaken, and played Morehouse, winning by a score of 38-10. Jackson State, the game that I did a pregame show at this past weekend, hosted Tuskegee and defeated Tuskegee by a score of 30-0. Now, I'll get to that game when I cover SWAC. But anyway, Edward Waters, as I said earlier, played the number one team, projected number one team for the CIAA, and they defeated Virginia Union by a score of 41-38. Alabama State defeated Miles by a score of 37-9. Lane traveled to Allen University and lost by a score of 29-21. My upset alert, which I'll get into later on, Florida A&M was able to hold on and defeat Albany State. And another surprise, going into overtime, Grambling was able to hold on and hold off Kentucky State by a score of 37-31. That game was a huge surprise. And I have to admit, that was a huge surprise. I didn't see that one coming. That lets me know two things. Grambling they got problems. They were able to pull out the victory, probably because they had more players, more stamina, so they were able to throw more at Kentucky State. But that also lets me know that Kentucky State is pretty doggone good. They did lose to Albany State last week, but they played Albany State very tough. Albany State is one of those schools that they are returning all of the defensive players and all but two on the offense. So Albany State is they have a wealth of talent. And that's why I put Florida A&M on upset alert before the game even started, because I knew Albany State was going to just take it to Florida A&M. But let's take a look at the standings. And for the standings, here we are. Edward Waters is on top, 2-0 in conference play, 3-0 overall. So Edward Waters is playing to be the top team this upcoming season. I mean, this season right now. Followed by Benedict 1-0 in conference play, 2-0 overall as well. They're looking to get back on their winning ways, but there is Albany State losing their first game of the season to Florida A&M. And from what I understand, they had an opportunity to really win this game because at halftime, this game was right in step with what could have been a winning game or a game that could have been won by Albany State had it not been for a couple of mistakes that they made where they could have had a substantial lead going into halftime, but they did not. And then coming out of halftime, FAM was able to make some adjustments. But we'll get into that. But as you can see, with the standings, Albany State is in second place, is I guess you could say, tied for third with their overall record, being 2-1. And they're the same with Tuskegee and Clark Atlanta with records of 2-1 as well. Clark Atlanta having lost one, Tuskegee having lost this past weekend, along with Albany State. And then you have other teams that are 1-2. You have Allen and Kentucky State with an overall record of 1-2, but Kentucky State is 1-1 in conference, whereas Allen, along with Clark Atlanta, Tuskegee, Albany State, and Benedict, they all have a conference record of 1-0, but Edward Waters is the only one in conference that has played 2 games, and they are 2-0. Now, as far as other teams, you have Kentucky State 1-1, but everyone else, Savannah State, Lane, Fort Valley, Miles, and Central State, they are yet to taste victory in conference play, but Morehouse is yet to play a conference game. And also, all of those teams are yet to taste victory of any sort. That being Lane, Morehouse, Fort Valley State, Miles, and Central State. It's tough when you are working on your first victory. And it can be, in some cases, it can be somewhat demoralizing when you have players that's playing their heart out, but there seems not to be light at the end of the tunnel. And that's one of the things I can unfortunately say about Central State. They are really having a tough go of it at the moment. And it'll be interesting to see how well they're able to recover and recoup with their play, because the past couple of games that they've played, I don't think they've scored any points at all. And so what I'll do right now is confirm my suspicions of their scores. And even though we just saw for this past weekend, they did not score any points. And I do want to find out whether or not they have scored any points. And I believe they did in one game. But if they did, not many. And so the first one against their arch rival, they did score 24, losing to Kentucky State 34-24. But then they played Tuskegee, losing 33-0. And then this past week, they lost to Benedict by a score of 10-0. So when you play your arch rival, that tends to bring out the best in schools. But then you have a letdown. And you have to be able to maintain that energy throughout the season. Because here you are, you put everything on the field, but you didn't win. But you put everything out there. But you have to maintain that level of energy to just keep it going, so you can have that fight for the next game. And unfortunately, that's something Central State and their players need to be able to learn, how to be able to continue to build it up and to get that fight. Listen to the coach. Listen to his philosophy. Follow the techniques. Be fundamentally sound. And if you're fundamentally sound in your game, then guess what happens after that? You end up winning. But you have to listen. Now, games that are to be played this weekend, or should I say starting this Thursday, and games this week. And here you are. On Thursday, Tuskegee will travel to Benedict, having a short week after losing to Jackson State. And that game will be a 7 o'clock game in Columbia, South Carolina. And that game will be on ESPN+. Other games that will be played this upcoming Saturday. And here you are. Central State will travel to Morgan State. Another rough game for Central State. One game after the other. My gosh. Next, you have Morehouse hosting Kentucky State. And that's a conference game. Miles will host Savannah State. And that's another conference game. This game will be on ESPN+. Delta State will travel to Fort Valley State for a 3 o'clock game in Fort Valley, Georgia. Bethune-Cookman will host Edward Waters. Now, Bethune-Cookman has not had much success this year, and they need to be very careful. They need to be on upset alert as well, because Edward Waters right now is riding an undefeated season so far. Now, Bethune-Cookman should be successful, possibly in this game. We shall see. But I'm putting him, and let me come on camera, I'm putting Bethune-Cookman on upset alert right now, just like I did with Florida A&M. And I was close. I was close. My son was fit to be tied. Oh, my gosh, he was upset. But I'll get into that when we get to the SWAC. But here are the other games that will be played. Allen will host Clark Atlanta. That game is in Columbia, South Carolina. And I should clarify that Bethune hosting Edward Waters at Daytona Beach, Florida. And, of course, the last game, as you can see, Alabama A&M will host Lane College in Huntsville at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you want to see any of the games, as you can see on the far right-hand side that says links, all of these games will be in a place where you can watch them. Central State against Morgan State, ESPN+, Morehouse versus Kentucky State, the SIAC Network, Miles versus Savannah State, ESPN+, Fort Valley State versus Delta State, the SIAC Network, Edward Waters traveling to Bethune-Cookman on HBCU Go on the Griot. Clark Atlanta traveling to Allen on the SIAC Network, and Alabama A&M versus Lane on the SWAC TV Network. Make sure that if you do not have access to the Griot, games that are produced by HBCU Go, make sure you are able to tune in to the Griot to watch that. Also, if you have the ability to download the HBCU Go app, I believe they have the HBCU Go app, please do so. Also, for SWAC TV and the SIAC TV, SIAC Network, as well as the CIAA Network, make sure you download those so you can watch those games. With your support, and with your continued support, these teams are able to be seen around the country. And even for those that are outside the country, you're able to still watch your favorite HBCU. Now, let's move to the MEAC. And for the MEAC, you had some decent games here, and then some games that got a little out of hand. But just like some of the games in the Division II conference, but some of these games, unfortunately, got a little out of hand. And unfortunately, yes, we have to pay close attention, at preparing our teams. And if we're not in a position to prepare our teams for who they have to play, then you can get embarrassed. And here we are, looking at the scores for the MEAC. And the MEAC, Howard was finally able to get back on the winning track, winning over Morehouse, as I said. But Howard has been going through it quite a bit. And after having successful seasons, and also after having gone to the Celebration Bowl 2 years ago, they have fallen on hard times. And I can easily say for Coach Scott, I'm very surprised to see a Coach Scott coached team not have as much success as I'm expecting them to have. And for this to happen, I am highly surprised. But they got back on the winning track, defeating Morehouse. Now, granted, a lot of people say, well, it's just Morehouse. But you still never know what can happen when a Division II school play a Division I. Because look at what almost happened when Albany State played Florida A&M and Kentucky State played Grambling. And I'm also putting Bethune-Cookman on upset alert for next week. And I'm telling you, so when Bethune-Cookman plays next week, and Bethune-Cookman plays Edward Waters, and when they play Edward Waters, they better be ready. I'm just saying. So, other games and the scores for the MEAC conference. Here we go. Delaware State doing pretty good in the so far, and we'll see what they're doing in the conference. But Delaware State, here they are, and they're holding their own. Granted, they played Bowie State, but you defeat the teams that are on your schedule and that are in front of you. And that's exactly what Delaware State is doing, defeating Bowie State by a score of 36-14. Morgan State traveled to Toledo, and Toledo did not have any mercy on them, defeating Morgan State by a score of 60-0. Rutgers hosted Norfolk State, and they also hung 60 on Norfolk State, but Norfolk State was able to score 10 points in that game. Bethune-Cookman, in a very entertaining game against South Carolina State, they were able to play South Carolina State very tough. And in this game, they lost. That means Bethune-Cookman lost to South Carolina State by a score of 55-41. And North Carolina Central getting back on their winning ways as well. Defeated Fayetteville State by a score of 49-14. This was a week for the HBCU conferences to play against their, as much as I hate to say it like this, but to play their little brothers. That's a part of Division II. And as you can see, all of the games that the Division I, whether it was the MEAC or the SWAC, playing SIAC or CIAA schools. So it was this week that these schools played their little brothers. And this year, up to this point, Big Brother defeated the little brother. And the only reason why I say it like that is Big Brother being the MEAC and the SWAC being Division I schools, little brothers being Division II, the CIAA and the SIAC. But don't get it twisted. Just because they have fewer scholarships, the SIAC and the CIAA, these guys can play. Take them lightly, and they will beat you. Again, take them lightly, and they will beat you. Look at what almost happened to Grambling and Florida A&M. Now, let's take a look at the schedule. At the standings for the MEAC. Now, as you can see, the standings for the MEAC, Delaware State, 2 in a row. After losing that first game that they did not look bad in that first game. But here they are winning 2 in a row. Delaware State currently tied with Howard and South Carolina State. Howard, they're trying to hold their own. And it'll be interesting because next week is going to be a big game. And I'll really get into that. But Howard is 2-1. Let's see if they can hold their own and continue to push through. And Delaware State, Howard, and South Carolina State, all three of those teams, they are at 2-1. And North Carolina Central, they played 2 heavy games that they ended up losing, but they ended up getting back on the winning track. They are 2-2. Norfolk State, having won last week, but they lost this past weekend, they are 1-2. And Morgan State, they have been playing some really tough games coming out of the chute, and they're 0-3. But this upcoming week, as we saw earlier, they should have a win. Without a doubt. They should be able to win this upcoming week. Without a doubt. And even though they are 0-3, but when they hit the field, shouldn't be a doubt of who will win that game this upcoming week for Morgan State. And we talked about it earlier, but we'll talk about it again as we take a look at the schedule for this upcoming week. And here we are. South Carolina State will travel to South Florida, and that game will be on ESPN Plus. And Morgan State, as I said, will host Central State. Central State, in their last 2 games, are yet to score a point after having scored 24 points against their arch rival, Kentucky State. But as you can see, Central State will have to travel to Morgan State for a 12 p.m. game, which will be seen on ESPN Plus. And I can tell you guys, I am not looking forward to seeing what could possibly happen to Central State. Because Morgan State, guys, they're coming off their 3rd big loss. And they're looking for something, anything to turn their season around as they prepare for the upcoming conference season, which will be in a couple of weeks. But this week, everything is going to be right with the world for Morgan State. I just feel sorry for Central State. Sorry, guys. I just don't see any light at the end of the tunnel this week. But let's continue with the games for the MEAC. And here we are. St. Francis will host Delaware State. And we'll see if Delaware State can continue with their march. And who is the true HU? Howard University will travel to Hampton University. And that game will be played in Washington, D.C. And the true HU will stand up and will be seen. So Howard will travel to Hampton, and that game is going to be huge. I don't know if it's going to be seen anywhere, but I can tell you one thing. The real HU will show up, and one of these HUs will win. And I can tell you, Howard and Hampton, those are 2 proud institutions, and they both say they are the true HU, but whoever wins, they will have bragging rights for football for a year. Let's continue on. Norfolk State will host Sacred Heart. That game will be on ESPN Plus as well. And last, North Carolina Central will host their arch rival, North Carolina A&T, at 4 p.m. And that game will be seen on Flow Sports. Great weekend as they are preparing to get into conference. for the MEAC. And I can tell you guys, I'm looking forward to a couple of games here. The games that I'm looking forward is Howard against Hampton. That's one game that I'm looking forward to seeing, as well as whether or not Delaware State can continue their run. And they lost their first game of the season, but I want to see how Delaware State would fare against St. Francis. And the reason why I bring that up is when you have teams that all of a sudden they build up their confidence, and the coach is telling the team, look, you have the aptitude, you have the ability to win. Just listen to what I say. Sometimes players play above their weight. And what I mean by that is a player may be, for those of you who understand sports, may be a 1 or 2 star player. But if you are coached properly and you listen to your coach, you listen to the philosophy, and you adhere to the position you're supposed to play, not going outside of what your coach tells you to do, you're playing above your weight class. And every once in a while, that 1 or 2 star player is now playing like a 3 or 4 star player, or that 3 star player may be playing like a 4 or even a 5 star player. Every once in a while, that coach has great influence over those players. So the coach, let's see what Deshaun Jackson is going to do the rest of the season with these guys from Delaware State. Now, don't get me wrong, Delaware State played pretty well last year. And so, as far as I was concerned, they just had to just get pushed and have the right coaching. But we'll see. We shall see how well they fare against St. Francis this upcoming weekend. And that's going to be a 1 p.m. game on ESPN Plus, even though I have obligations during that same time frame. But at 2 o'clock, as soon as I jump in my car, I'm going to have multiple games being seen on both of my phones. and I'll be listening as I'm driving. So it's going to be fun. But guys, watch the games. Enjoy the games. Because if you don't, you're going to miss out on what can happen. Now we're coming to the SWAC and all 12 teams. And I think just about all teams were in action this past week. And if not all, the majority of them. So let's go ahead and take a look at who we have. And here we are. Albany State, as I said, traveled to Florida A&M. This game went back and forth. Florida A&M almost lost this game to Albany State. As I said, one of the buddy of mine who works at Albany State indicated to me that in the first half, Albany State had at least 2 opportunities to take a lead. And had they at least kicked field goals instead of going for it and being stopped by the defense, but at least kicked field goals, they possibly could have won this game. But you never know. But this is why you play the game. Sometimes you second guess yourself. Sometimes you overthink it. And because in this situation, he overthunk what he was doing. Unfortunately, they did not win the game. But this was a winnable game for Albany State. Florida A&M, they're going to have a tough go of it. And you will see what's going to happen to them this weekend. Now, I'm putting them on upset alert right now, even though it's going to be a SWAC game. But I do not see Florida A&M winning this weekend coming up, and I'll show you why. Other games. Of course, as we talked about earlier, Jackson State hosted Tuskegee. And Jackson State, I cannot remember the exact number of freshmen that Jackson State played, but they played close to 20 freshmen. It was not 20, but they played almost 20 freshmen in this game against Tuskegee, giving others a chance to be able to play and see action. So could this game have been a runaway for Jackson State? Yes, it could have been very bad for Tuskegee. But Coach Taylor, he decided to put in multiple freshmen in this game so they could see playing time against Tuskegee. And they played pretty well. And as you can see, the score was 30-0. And as he said during his post-game press conference, he believed that Jackson State could hold Tuskegee to 0 points, and they were able to. But the one thing that Jackson State has to do is they must be careful because they are having too many penalties. And they had roughly 10 penalties again against a team such as Tuskegee. Now, Tuskegee, don't get me wrong, as you recall their record in the SIAC, they're 2-1, and they have a pretty good team. So in that division, in that conference, they will be one of those teams to reckon with. And so when Clark Atlanta, Tuskegee, and I'm missing one. Clark Atlanta, Tuskegee, and and of course Fort Valley State and Albany State. Once those teams play against each other, they're going to just knock off each other. Albany State and Clark Atlanta, as far as I'm concerned, they are the class. They're the top teams. But Tuskegee will have something to say about that. Fort Valley State, even though they just lost to Clark Atlanta, as far as I'm concerned, they will also have something to say in the end. But I know we're done with the SIAC, but I believe even though Albany State and Clark Atlanta play each other in about a couple of weeks, if I'm not mistaken, I believe that those two teams will play again in the championship game for the SIAC. But let's continue on with the games in the SWAC. As I said, Jackson State defeated Tuskegee, but here, Alabama A&M traveled to Tennessee State, winning by a score of 23-21, just holding on against Tennessee State. Alabama State, as I said earlier, played Miles and defeated Miles by a score of 37-9. Mississippi State hosted Alcorn and did not have any mercy on them, defeating them by a score of 63-0. UAPB, Arkansas Pine Bluff, defeated Lincoln of California by a score of 34-8. Bethune traveled to South Carolina State, losing to them by a score of 41-55. Texas Southern hosted Lamar, losing to Lamar by a score of 31-7. Prairie View traveled to Rice, losing to Rice by a score of 38-17. Southeastern Louisiana hosted Mississippi Valley State, and Mississippi Valley State took it on the chin this time by a score of 56-3. And Kentucky State traveled to Grambling. And as I said, this game was a big surprise, with Grambling having to hold on and make it to overtime. And with them making it to overtime, and then they eventually won in overtime by a score of 37-31. I can tell you right now, I did not see this coming with Tennessee. I saw the game against Albany State and Florida A&M because how well Albany State has been playing throughout the season. But if Albany State had made the proper adjustments against Florida A&M in the second half and matched the adjustments that Florida A&M made against Albany State would have won. But Grambling against Kentucky State, this just lets me know that Kentucky State is a much better team than we give them credit for. Coach Huggins has those guys playing. This is his, if I'm not mistaken, this may be his third season with Kentucky State. But with Grambling, guys, I'm just saying, Grambling, you got some, Coach Joseph. If you don't get your boys right, you may be finding another job. Because I can tell you, now don't get me wrong, Kentucky State defeated us back in 2019 in the Celebration Bowl. When I say us, Jackson State. But that was a different coach. And Coach Charlie Jackson at that time was a hell of a coach. And he had Kentucky State playing where they were either number 1, number 2, or number 3 in the conference. And they played a hell of a game. But now Kentucky State is all of a sudden slowly but surely creeping back up there. It's going to be interesting. They may be right now the 4th best team in the conference. Just period, because of how they're playing. I still say Fort Valley State will have something to say about it, but Kentucky State might be that surprise team in the SIAC, or is it that Grambling just isn't that good? That's something that we have to look at. Grambling this year may not be that good, and they may be struggling just to be able to do well and just to be able to win a couple of games. So, but that's something that we're going to have to see. But Grambling, they have a winning record. But for them to play against Kentucky State and play the way they did, either Kentucky State has a hell of a team and they played well above their pay grade, or Grambling has issues. But like I said, Graham has a winning record, and it'll be interesting to see how well they play the rest of the season. Now let's talk about the rest of the games, or the last game, and that game was a late game because it was on the West Coast, where Southern traveled to Fresno State. And as you can see, Fresno State ended up winning that game by a score of 56-7. And that was a long way to go. But that was one of the games that was on the schedule. Now, Southern University, they're very surprised. I'm very surprised at them, at how they are currently playing so far. And they now, granted, Fresno State is a Division I school, different conference, different type of team. And that was one of those games that a lot of people just said, yes, it's just one of those money games that Southern was playing. But right now, Southern is not looking good. They had a decent showing in the MEAC SWAC Challenge. But after that, guys, they have been struggling. But we'll see in 2 weeks how well Southern is. But let's take a look at the standings, and I'll tell you why and what's going on in 2 weeks. But as you look at the standings, you have Jackson State, Jackson State, Alabama A&M, and Alabama State. All three of those teams are at 2-1 in the East. And I can tell you right now, the cream of the crop right now is Jackson State and Alabama State. But it seems like Alabama A&M is going to have something to say about who's going to come out of this conference, or should I say out of this division, as a winner. And as we take a look again, as I bring this up, Jackson State, Alabama A&M, and Alabama State, these guys are at 2-1 overall. Florida A&M is at 1-2. Mississippi State, Mississippi Valley State and Bethune-Cookman, they are at 0-3, yet to taste victory of any sort. Now in the West, and I'm sorry guys, I think that of the two divisions, this is the weaker division. In the SWAC, you have Prairie View having defeated Texas Southern in conference play. This is the only conference game that has been played between each division. Next, they are at 1-2, but Grambling is the only team with a winning record in the West. at 2-1. As I said, here they are. They have a winning record, but they've not looked good, guys. Graham has not looked good in their losses. And so even in the one loss. So even in the win that they had, we'll see. Now, the one thing I could easily say, Jackson State has had issues with Grambling. They lost to Grambling last year. It's just one of those things that some teams, regardless how well you play, you just don't match up well against some teams. And Grambling just happens to be that team for Jackson State. They just don't match up well against Graham. But we'll see in the next few weeks when Jackson State plays Grambling on October 25th in Las Vegas. But that game is coming up much later on in the year. Now, as we continue on, going back to the East, Jackson State and those two schools in Alabama. Alabama State is going to have a lot to say about who wins this conference. I can tell you that right now. It is not looking good for all of these schools because Alabama State, as you can see that record, they will end up saying, okay, whoever we play, we're planning on dominating. And right now, that's what Alabama State is doing. Now, this upcoming week, folks, pretty much almost the entire conference is taking off this weekend, with the exception of 4 teams. And so here you are. You have Bethune-Cookman hosting Edward Waters. That game is going to be at 2 o'clock at Daytona Beach. Next, you have Prairie View hosting Northwestern State. That game should be an easy win for Prairie View. But Northwestern State did knock off Alcorn. Grambling will host East Texas A&M University. Have no idea about East Texas A&M University. But then you also have Lane traveling to Alabama A&M, which should be an easy, as much as I hate to say it like that, but it should be an easy win for Alabama A&M. Now, why am I pointing out next week? Not this weekend coming, but next week. And I'm just going to point out one game, Jackson State versus Southern University. Now, for that particular game that's coming up, that's going to be a big rivalry game. And for the most part, sometimes it just doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter what the record is. And because of that, when Jackson State and Southern played, and unfortunately there was a time when Southern, they just ran roughshod over Jackson State. And I think they had like either an 8 or a 10-year record against Jackson State, where they were just beat Jackson State in football, and it just didn't matter. And unfortunately, they had their way. And what I'm looking for is the upcoming schedule, because I want to be able to discuss the upcoming games that are coming up against these teams, and hopefully I get a chance to pull them up. Now, as I said, the 27th, that's going to be a week of reckoning, and we are going to talk about those games next week. But this week, you saw the 4 games that are being played in the SWAC. Now, on the weekend of the 27th, which is why you have so many teams taking off this week, having only 4 games, and for the 4 teams that are playing, you could almost say that this is a bye week, and this is a get well, quote unquote, get well game for the 4 teams where you saw, and I'll bring these teams back up. Bethune playing Edward Waters, even though I am putting Bethune-Cookman on upset alert. Prairie View hosting Northwestern State. Grambling playing East Texas A&M University, and Alabama A&M playing Lane. as much as I hate to say it, I can see one of those teams losing. I don't want to say it too loud, but I can see one of these teams losing. Now, as far as the 27th, with these teams saying, okay, we're going to take off this weekend. And here's why. Alabama State will travel to Florida A&M. That's going to be a big game. Because if Florida A&M ends up losing to Alabama State, that's a statement game for Alabama State. Because that puts them in the rocking chair, saying that, yeah, we're here and we're on top of the East Division, and now you got to come for us, because that'll be one of the games that'll be played in the East for number one. Next, you also have Alabama A&M that will travel to Bethune-Cookman. That game is going to be a conference game for the East. Valley will host Texas Southern. So now you're getting into all of the conference games, conference play. Alcorn, as I said, will host UAPB. Jackson State travels to Southern. That game, more than anything else, is going to be huge. Jackson State is one of a few teams that can go down to Southern and defeat Southern. But this is not this weekend. These games are next week on the 27th of September. And Grambling will travel to Prairie View for a 6 p.m. game. And all of these games, guys, this is why the SWAC has very few games for the 20th, which is this weekend. But the 27th, that's going to be, how you doing? We're entering conference play. And when conference play opens up on the weekend of the 27th, when it is in full force and effect, guys, I'm telling you this. If you're not ready for a conference play, it's going to show. And I'm going to hate to see what's going to happen to you and your team. Because if you're not ready for conference play, but all of these teams are going to be ready for conference play. I can tell you that right now. Especially that Jackson State Southern game, that's going to be a whale of a game. The Alabama State Florida A&M game, that's going to be a huge game. Fortunately, the Alabama State Florida A&M game will be at 2 p.m. and the Jackson State Southern game will be at 6 p.m. So that'll give me enough time to be able to watch both games. But let's see what happens. But folks, make sure you take the time to support your favorite HBCU. Give, so the giving can continue from the HBCU schools to the students. Because if you don't give, why should others give to you? So may God bless you. May God keep you. And we will see you. And as a matter of fact, as I said, look out for me to have an late afternoon show just before the Johnson C. Smith Virginia Union game. And it will be right here out of my studio. So may God bless you, may God keep you, and support your favorite HBCU. God bless.